È un fatto che affinché ci sia sviluppo
As a matter of
economico sia
fact,
necessaria la pace.
we need
Affinché
peace
ci
for
sia la
an
pace,
economic
siano
development, and for
indispensabili
peace
sviluppo
we need
economico e
economic
prosperità.
development and
In questa simmetria
prosperity. In
perfetta,
this
la
perfect
violenza, la
symmetry,
guerra, la
violence, war,
sopraffazione si distinguono come
are
primo
the
ostacolo ad
first
una crescita
primary
economica nel
obstacle
lungo
to a
periodo.
long-term economic growth.
In questo senso la
And
peace
the
economics
peace
si pone
economics
l'obiettivo di
has the
studiare e
aim to study
progettare
and
le
design
istituzioni politiche ed
political and
economiche, ma
economic
anche le
institutions, but
strategie
even
per prevenire,
strategies to
mitigare o
prevent,
risolvere
mitigate, or
qualsiasi
solve
genere di
the
conflitto.
conflicts of any kind.
Per molti anni, la
For many
profonda
years, the
incidenza della
profound
pace e della
impact of
prosperità
peace
è
on
stato un elemento
prosperity
escluso dai
has been
parametri della ricerca
excluded
economica, più ancorata alle
as a
dinamiche fra
valid
scambi volontari,
economic
mercato e tariffe.
parameter.
Oggi non è più
Nowadays,
possibile
it is no
ragionare in questi
longer
termini.
possible to think according
E
to these
soprattutto,
parameters,
in un
and
momento di declino
in a
economico per
period
molti
of
paesi,
economic decline for
occorre
many
cercare
countries,
prospettive
we need to
nuove
look
per
for
invertire
new
questa tendenza
perspectives
negativa.
to invert this
Se fosse
negative
la pace la strada da
trend. And if
percorrere,
peace would be the right solution, and if peace would really be the right solution, the path to be followed, we are going to talk with the main world experts. I would like to call to the floor Linda Bilmes, professor of public politics at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. She is one of the greatest experts worldwide as far as the cost of wars are concerned. She published many books and bestsellers, the $3,000 billion war, jointly with Stiglitz, the cost of wars and the economic impact through which, on the contrary, it would be possible to fund the possibility to avoid wars from emerging. Then John Dunne, professor emeritus of economics at the University of West of England. His focus is on peace economics, security, safety. He belongs to the group of Economists for Peace and Safety. He publishes economics and services, and with Jürgen Braun, he wrote a book focused on peace economics. And then Alex Mintz, he is the dean of the Lauder School of Government at the Interdisciplinary Herzliya Center in Israel. He's director of the Institute for Policy and Strategy. He is the editor of Political Psychology Review, and he worked even with the report with a newspaper of the Yale Economics. And then with Raul Caruso, presently he is a professor at the Università Cattolica in Milan. He's professor of economic policy, and he is at the head of Peace Economics, and which is one of the few magazines worldwide focused on the peace economics. I would like to know from them which are the economic indicators to build peace, because quite often peace is considered to be something very idealistic, and they're going to make their presentations, and afterwards, please send via social media and all the other media questions and so on. Linda, you have the floor.
So thank you very much for inviting me to your absolutely beautiful city. And thank you also for being here. I know you've been here for quite a few hours today, and this conference has been going on for a long time, so it's lovely to see you all here. Our topic today is peace economics, and I am going to speak to you about one aspect of this. Can I just see a show of hands? How many of you in the audience have studied economics? Those are just little hands, big hands. How many have you have studied economics? Okay. And how many have studied peace economics? Just a few hands. Okay, so peace economics is an interesting field, partly because no one knows what it is. There are many different aspects of it. I'm going to speak to you about one aspect, which is how we account for the costs of war. have 3 points that I'm going to make. First is that we systematically underprice the cost of war. Second, that military costs are distributed across a wide range of government departments. And third, that the lack of transparency about the true costs of war makes it much easier for countries to reach for military solutions. So let me begin with the first point. If we think about the cost of war, we can identify at least 5 different types of costs. The first type are the immediate costs of sending troops and equipment into a conflict. For most countries, even these immediate costs are extra to the money we spend on the military. So in Italy, as in the United States and Britain and many countries, the military is already paid for, military salaries are paid for by the government, and wars cost extra. So for example, in the United States today, we are spending nearly $3 million per year per troop who is stationed in Afghanistan, in addition to all the standard costs of paying the salary of those troops. The second type of cost are long-term costs to the government budget. And many of these costs include the cost of replenishing equipment, of medical care and disability compensation for veterans, for reconstruction after war. These kind of costs are very significant and they last for a long time. For example, the armistice, World War I, ended in 1918. But the peak year, the top year for paying disability compensation for World War I veterans in the United States was in 1969, more than 50 years later. The peak year for paying disability compensation for World War II veterans was in 1986. The cost for Vietnam veterans is still climbing. In the current Iraq and Afghanistan wars in the United States, more than 1 million veterans have already been promised lifetime disability compensation. And that will cost over their lifetime a minimum of $1 trillion. That's $1 million. A third type of war costs that are not counted are social costs. This is the impact on people's lives, on their families, careers, quality of life, domestic violence, divorce, homelessness, crime. Many of these costs are paid by individuals, by local governments, by civil society. And these costs are also very significant, although they're not counted. To give you just one example, in the entire Iraq and Afghanistan conflict since the beginning, the United States has lost 6,850 soldiers. Just this year alone, just this year, more than 8,000 veterans have committed suicide, with 22 veterans committing suicide every day. So more than 100,000 veterans have committed suicide during this period. Many of them after a long struggle with substance abuse, domestic problems, crime, and other social costs. But these are costs that are not counted. A fourth type of costs for war are economic costs. For example, the invasion of Iraq contributed to an increase in the price of oil from $25 a barrel to $140 a barrel within 2 years, which contributed to the Federal Reserve injecting liquidity into the US economy, which contributed to the housing bubble, which contributed to the financial crisis. A fifth type of costs that are not counted are financial costs. So in the case of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, all of the costs, all the money that has been spent has been borrowed, which means that not only is there interest payments on that cost, but there is a widening gap in society between the tiny percentage of those who fight in the wars and the rest of the population that doesn't engage in the war, but also doesn't pay, because all of that money will be repaid by our grandchildren, great-grandchildren, leading to a huge gap in the shared burden. I've mentioned 5 types of costs, but the government accounts only for the first type of cost, the very immediate short-term costs. So in effect, every time a member of the government votes to spend money on wars, they're looking at a tiny fraction of the total cost. They're voting, for example, to allocate $50 million to a war, but in fact, the cost will be a significant multiple, 3 or 4 times the cost of that. Let me turn to the second point, which is that in most countries, military costs are distributed across a wide range of government departments and agencies, so they are very difficult to keep track of. For example, in the United States, the foreign aid budget is dominated by military aid, where we provide weapons to a variety of countries around the world, or we provide loans with which they can purchase weapons. The Energy Department purchases fuel for the military. The Housing and Labor Departments provide substantial support for returning veterans, and so forth. This is a simple point, but in fact, the complexity of actually tracking total military costs, total military expenditure, is substantial. My third point related to the first two is that the fact that we only account for a tiny fraction of the war, and the fact that military costs are distributed throughout an economy and not tracked properly, leads to a lack of transparency on what it costs to wage war and what it costs and what we spend on the military. We know from economics that actually people make different decisions based on what things cost. And if you were purchasing a car for 20,000 euros and you discovered there was a hidden price of 40,000 more euros, so the car actually cost 60,000 euros, you might decide not to buy that car. You certainly might decide not to spend money on other things because you didn't have enough money for them, because you actually had to spend 60,000 euros, not 20,000 euros on the car. This is a very basic principle, but applied to war costs, it means that if there is no transparency and we systematically underprice and make it complicated to understand how much money is being spent in this area, it means that first, we are more likely to get involved in military conflicts. Second, that we are more likely to stay engaged and to escalate military conflicts. Third, that we are more likely to strengthen institutions that feed off military interventions. And fourth, that we have less money available for investing in non-military things, such as education, infrastructure, environment, healthcare, etc. Finally, I want to say a word about what is the solution to this. Of course, the economics of war and peace are very complicated, but actually, this is one of the easier problems to fix. It is within our capability, given the science of economics, given the standards of accounting, that governments actually could produce a full accounting for war and for military spending, including long-term costs, social costs, economic costs, financial costs, and military costs spread across government. So I leave you with the message that one of the most realistic things, one of the easiest most practical things that you can actually do is to demand that your government provide full reckoning of military spending, where the money is spent, how long the money is distributed across, and full cost of war. Thank you.
Grazie a Linda Bilmes. Chiedo
Thank you to Linda Bilmes.
invece
Now
adesso
like
di portare il suo contributo a John Dunne
for
e
his
continuare nella linea che, come vedete, è di analisi ma anche di richiesta diretta di quello che possiamo fare noi, premendo soprattutto sui nostri governanti.
By lobbying on our politicians. Thank you.
Sorry, I should have some slides. What I wanted to try and, yep, excellent. What I wanted to talk to you today was to build upon some of the things that Linda's just been speaking about and try to provide a bit of context about, first of all, how we have this defense industry or this military industry and military sector which has come to have such an importance for us and how it is preventing us from moving towards what we would call a peace economy. And yeah, that's working. Okay, so the first thing to note is that military spending is basically very high. It's also very, very high historically. Now, one of the reasons for this is that some of you might not remember it very well, but there has been the Cold War. There's been a superpower arms race between the Soviet Union and the West. And this led to massive levels of historically incredibly high military spending and spending on arms, which then created a sort of industrial sector that was very strange. And the result of these resources going into the military sector led to the creation of a military-industrial complex, which became a set of vested interests which was very good at maintaining itself. The thawing of the Cold War between the mid-80s and it really started was a huge impact upon the sector because there was a reduction in arms trade, which basically the arms trade was halved in a 10-year period. Now, what we've seen since then is the growth of new threats, and we've also seen an increase in post 9/11. We started to get an increase in military spending, and as Linda points out, this is simply the military spending we can observe. There's a lot more resources going into this than we quite realize. Now, more recently, this has sort of flattened off. But I think just looking at, if I graph military spending in the US, you'll actually see that it's very high. If you look at the period where we had the Cold War, you would expect after a superpower arms race a massive reduction in the resources devoted to the sector, and this is something that basically has not happened. And we've had this big growth. Now, the evidence as well is that the types of the growth in weapon systems has not necessarily been. Is there a problem? Yeah. Okay, thank you. So the growth in military spending that we've been seeing has not been necessarily particularly successful, and much of the resources still goes on weapon systems which are hangovers from the previous period. So what we're really seeing is that the military spending patterns are not really linked to security considerations. So what they're linked to is this hangover from the Cold War. The nature of weapon systems, the types of weapon systems that are produced, the attitudes of people have all been affected. And in fact, President Eisenhower many years ago warned America at the end of his tenure as president about all of these things, how the vested interests within the this sector that's been constructed during the Cold War was a threat because it was basically keeping the expenditure much higher than was necessary and was threatening freedoms. And we've seen this continue with what's called the revolving door, where many people move between the military, the industry, and politics, and they make a lot of money, and they have a very clear goal, which is to maintain this level of spending. And often it's simply not tied to whatever change in threat is occurring, as I've said. So this also leads to an attempt to provide military solutions to particular problems. An example in the US is the recent response to Ebola. And it's not clear that these are the best solutions to the problems, that if you actually put the money into civil humanitarian aid and civil NGOs, etc., you'd actually provide something that was more efficient. That's something I don't have time to go into, but there's some interesting issues within that. And so the arguments that you also get, as an economist, I'm always confronting these, is that military spending is both important for the economy and important for industry. But basically, this is a myth. If we have an increase in military spending, then it will affect, it's like an increase in any government spending. It's a way of stimulating demand in the economy. But we can always do better by putting money into health, education, and other forms of government spending. There's always an opportunity cost, as we call it in economics, which is the cost of using the money for other things. For example, if you want to create employment, you put the money somewhere else. If people argue that cutting military spending will create unemployment, well, it won't. You'll actually create more jobs if you move the money into other areas of the economy. And the thing to remember is that the Cold War created a sector which was very, very strange. It constructed weapons, what have been called Baroque weapons, where people were more interested in it sounded really lethal. It sounded as though it would kill lots of people, but it actually didn't have to work because it just had to be a good idea. And there's a hangover of this in many of the weapon systems that we see thrown around today, because they were things like the Eurofighter, which were all designed 20 years ago with the aim of confronting a superpower in Europe, but are now increasingly sold on. So what we have then is the creation of a defense industrial base with a particular structure. And so the industry that we have now, the defense industry, is actually very, very good at getting money out of government rather than actually producing goods in a manufacturing sense. So they will always be very good at doing that. So it's also the case that this industry has got a very, very good way of advertising itself, but in actual fact, it's actually not that important for most modern economies. It also takes expertise and scientific and engineering expertise away from civil users. The companies themselves have become very, very different. They've internationalized. They've been involved in the arms trade. And the pressures to reduce costs have led to governments assisting companies in the arms trade to reduce the costs and to assist them in selling to countries that they probably shouldn't really sell to. But also, this has become a very corrupt place, because you cannot compete on cost against the Americans because of their demand. And so you have to compete on non-price things. And this is often turned into competition for commissions and bribes and the use of what we call offsets, but I won't go into that. There's basically an overcapacity in the industry. Within Europe, we produce 3 fighters, and yet our demand for fighter aircraft is tiny relative to that of the US. And if we just look at Europe as a whole, it just doesn't make economic sense. This is an industry which should look like the most concentrated industries in the world. Why doesn't it? Because governments prevent it from restructuring, and they maintain it. They try to maintain a defense industrial base within their own country and support these sectors. So they're highly subsidized. The other thing is that people will tell you, but of course the military R&D provides you with all sorts of spin-offs. Well, if you actually look into those spin-offs, it's not clear that the military has had that many. And the ones that we hear, like the internet, it's not clear that the military didn't actually invent the internet. It had an involvement in its development, but it didn't invent it. And what we find nowadays is that most of the technologies that go into weapon systems are actually spinning in from these dynamic IT, electronics industries in the civil sector. And this is, in Britain, it's called taking civil off-the-shelf technologies and putting them into weapon systems. So the economic effects are never completely clear. And there are a number of channels that, if we look at it in general, we can't, from a theoretical perspective as economists, judge the impact. It's basically an empirical question. There are some. It creates jobs, but there are better ways of doing it. It can actually lead to training of the labor force, but it can also take skilled labor away. And so it all becomes an empirical question. And working in this area, I've done a lot of empirical work, and I've never found military spending to have a positive effect. And in a recent survey that we did, we found that if you take empirical studies that include the Cold War period, you don't find positive, but you don't really find significant negative effects. But if you now look at the data that takes into account the end of the Cold War, we're increasingly finding that military spending has a negative effect upon growth. And this is cross countries and within countries. It's becoming almost a consensus. We've also got some worrying developments that have been occurring in that the internationalization of the industry has actually led to a reduction in transparency of the way it operates. We really can't see what's going on as readily as we used to be able to do. And another worrying development that should concern this audience is that there have been big changes in the role that private companies play in conflict. So in the past, most defense companies, the largest defense companies, would simply be producing weapons, and they'd make their profits whether these weapons were used or not. The problem now is that they actually make a lot of money by being in conflict. There are private military service companies that provide guards and provide mercenaries. They make money from conflict. There are basically contracts for private companies to maintain equipment in conflict zones. There's also the privatization of military roles continuously of that type. And also some of the largest American defense companies now have been those involved in reconstruction and in civil engineering roles within conflict zones. Now this may not sound an issue, but what it does mean is that from having a sector that was getting the benefits simply from producing weapons, we now have one that can actually make profits from conflict. That is something that I think the peace movement has to start worrying about. So we see, as I've said, the vested interest looking for military solutions and not considering the alternatives. So just briefly, one of the reasons why I say this is we should recognize that we've got these high levels of military spending. It's not obvious why. The threats we face we're not spending the money on the threats that we face. We're spending the money just on the sector. And what we have is to recognize that, because if we don't, then we can't actually see how we can move away from it. I think the point about peace economics is that recognition is the first step. We then recognize that there are these vested interests and we work against them. We need to recognize that there's a shadow economy of the arms trade and the arms industry and these shady arms dealers that we have to recognize and confront. We need to make the influence of these forces transparent, and we need to recognize that there are economic costs to the maintenance of this sector and these constructs. And we need to suggest alternatives. And I haven't really got much time to do this, but remember that economics reflects the logic of the underlying system and institutions and structures there. That countries that are at war have war economies. These war economies are not like peace economies, they're very different. And what we often forget is that if we want to move from a position of conflict or a position of where we're dominated by the preparation for conflict, we really have to see the benefits of peace and recognize that how difficult it is to make those changes. In post-conflict situations, it's often problematic because people think all we need to do is to have peace in terms of a peace accord, and then we can stop and everything will work. Well, it just doesn't happen at all. So we need to create structures that reflect the logic of the peaceful relations that make conflict unlikely. We need to move away from a reliance on offensive force structures. We need to recognize the importance of economic security. It's interesting that most of the debate in economics has been about how whether or not military spending has a negative effect, but it certainly does seem to be the case that if you really want to spend a lot of money on military, then the best thing to do is to actually become economically powerful and economically strong, and then you can afford to spend it, which is, in a sense, the other way of looking at it. So we have a set of ways of dealing through this with, we have to create, we can try to deal with this through creating a social contract, recognizing the needs to develop formally, and to actually recognize the careful role of interventions. And these are points that I'm making not just for our own economy, but also for those countries coming out of conflict in the developing world. The point is that, as we've seen, peace economics is not a big field, but it's a field that in the future has got to increase and has got to be taken more seriously. And thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dunne. And then I ask Alex Mintz to join the podium and to tell us what are his studies about, what kind of strategy we can start just to change and reverse things. Thank you.
Hi. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me for this important conference. During the conference, we talked about such issues as how to fight poverty, malnutrition, how to deal with challenges in the education and health systems, how to make reforms in government, in different programs, and most importantly, how to advance peace. Government, in order for governments to effectively and successfully deal with peace and to advance those reforms, we need leaders who can structure decision units such as coalitions or cabinets or advisory groups in such a way that will facilitate these important policies. Surprisingly and regretfully, this is not the case typically. The key concept in group decision making is groupthink. which was advanced by Janice about 30 years ago, which puts a premium on conformity of group members to group opinions and decisions due to peer pressure, cohesion of the group, censorship, and so on. And one of the consequences of groupthink is defective or bad decisions. What I'd like to do in this presentation is to introduce the concept of polithink, which is essentially the opposite of groupthink. And I'll also discuss the implications for peace economics, decisions on war and peace. So what is polithink? Polithink is essentially a plurality of opinions in a group, advisory group or coalition, and so on. So many and varied ways of perceiving the same problem, and it can be contrasted with the homogeneous way of groupthink. So the existence of contradictory interests within a group, sometimes even dissent, in groups that make decisions in government, create a situation where there is many times paralysis in decision making. The group cannot reach a consensus or even common interpretation of the reality and common policy goals. As is the case with groupthink, therefore, polythink leads to defective, suboptimal decisions and even to paralysis, as I said, in decision making. Some of the symptoms of polythink are, first of all, great likelihood for group conflict. As I said, even dissent within the group, as people within the advisory group or the coalition have different views of the situation and of different potential solutions. There is also a greater likelihood for leaks. Group members do not hold uniform views of the situation under polythink, and therefore they are more likely to leak information. Also, there is confusion and less likelihood for groups to speak in one voice, because under polythink there is greater likelihood that group members will talk to their constituencies, to their counterparts, to even to the media in different voices. Another symptom is more likelihood for framing effect. Under polythink, some members may frame offers, proposals, counter-proposals, and even disagreements in some way. They may give a positive spin, others may give a negative spin. No second chance under polythink. If the group agrees, the advisory group or the coalition or government agrees on policy, typically they will not try to revise it because the updating of offers and proposals is less likely because there is almost no consensus in a group. And adoption of group positions with lower common denominator. So we heard here about a lot of goals that the foundation sets and the conference wants to advance, and yet we see in reality, in practice, that the structure of advisory groups and coalitions and so on is such that they advance lowest common denominator or lowest common policy rather the ideal one. So some people under polythink, some decision makers conceptualize the decision problem in a very narrow way, other in a comprehensive and more encompassing way. But in contrast to groupthink, which is a quite well-known concept, in polythink, it's a mess. There is a plurality of opinions and even dissent in a group. And as I said, the structure of the decision unit affects the outcome. What are some of the potential explanations of polythink? I raised 5 different ones. First of all, I'll start with the institutional or bureaucratic one. Okay, under the bureaucratic explanation, as Graham Allison of the Kennedy School of Harvard pointed out, where you stand depends on where you sit. So members of the military have their own agenda, as was pointed out before here. Foreign ministry has its own institutional perspective as views. Intelligence community they have their own institutional interests. Cabinet members have their own perspectives and calculations. So this is very problematic because it leads to paralysis or suboptimal decisions. Another explanation is the political one. Especially in coalitionary governments, Robert Putnam coined the term two-level games. Essentially, policymakers work in two different levels, domestic and international. So when they negotiate internationally, they also think about domestic political calculations. And therefore, they take into account not just the international considerations, strategy and so on, but also domestic political considerations such as political audience cost. So they play essentially in a two-level game, especially in a multi-party coalition democracies where government typically consists of different parties. You have different platforms, agendas, constituencies, and interests. So in a two-level game, it's very difficult to promote and facilitate and implement decisions such as the ones that were suggested and advocated here. Great ideas. Sometimes it's difficult because of these structural constraints to advance them. Another explanation is the normative. People come with different personal values and worldviews. Some can be hawkish in a group, some are dovish, some are conservative, some are liberal. Problematic. Another explanation, the final one, is expert-novice divide. Okay, there is a difference between experienced group members and novice, new members, and that also affects their point of view and the different ways that they think rather than experts. And there is the leader-follower explanation, which is, which is also shows that leaders place significant constraint on the freedom of members of these advisory groups, and that also affects perceptions, choices, and policies. Why am I presenting it? I think it's very important that the structure, to understand that the structure of those decision units, the decision groups within government affects choices, policies, and outcomes. Okay, and our ability to advance the thing we discuss in this conference. So we need to take this factor into account. Leaders, smart leaders, need to engineer, so-called engineer or structure decision unit in a way that will facilitate the successful implementation and successful advance of those policies. What are some of the implications for defense economics? It's highly relevant to arms expenditures decisions, to arms races, to conflict initiation, escalation and termination, war and peace decisions. I'll give a few examples. Politics in defense spending, we have rivalries in the US among branches of the armed forces, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. Linda talked about defense spending in the US and the hidden cost and the long-term costs and so on. The politic within the group that makes decisions on defense spending causes increases in armament and defense spending due to pressures of each of representative of each unit, each armed services to get to push for its side of the story and to get more. But that's there is also on war and peace decisions. We see that in Pearl Harbor, in Iraq, the decisions were followed groupthink. Yet the decision to withdraw from Iraq followed a politic example or syndrome. US decisions on ISIS. Okay, I've written a book that will be published with Stanford University Press in a few months on the politic syndrome and applied it to US decisions on national security since 9/11, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Iran, and ISIS. And the decision to fight ISIS, the US decision, was a groupthink at the strategic level, okay? There was more or less an agreement of what on this decision. Yet at the tactical level, whether to send troops, boots on the ground, what to do, the Secretary of Defense, President Obama, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, each has a different opinion. It's very diverse. I'd like to give you an example from the peace negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians. How many of you know that there is 75% of Israelis and about 2/3, 66% of Palestinians support actually a two-state solution in the Middle East, okay? Yet the government, the Israeli government, is split on this important policy. There are ministers such as Livni and Perry and even Lapid who support peace with the Palestinians, yet there are those who are supporting the status quo, and still others that are on the right side of the coalition that support annexation of the West Bank. What is the end result of all of this? Paralysis in decision-making. The same thing on the Palestinian side. You have Abu Mazen that wants to advance peace, but then there is similarly Hamas and Fatah have different opinions on views on the peace process, and therefore they cannot get their acts together. So politic on both sides contributes to the deadlock in negotiations in the Middle East. Finally, what I'd like to say, if leaders of coalitionary governments and other forms of government want to advance policies, sign peace agreements, fight poverty, discrimination, work towards disarmament, they need to structure their, or engineer even, their decision group in such a way that will support such policies. And so this is the bottom line, that small group dynamics among members of decision units, such as groupthink and polythink, shape and constrain the freedom of action of policymakers. Thank you very much.
Grazie al professor Mintz che ci ha anche fatto riferimento al problema israelo-palestinese. Lui ha proposto con altri professori al governo israeliano di considerare una soluzione che i paesi arabi hanno portato avanti.
New solutions proposed by the other side.
Devo dire da scienziato di formazione pura, fisica, che gli economisti sono bravissimi, stanno nei tempi.
Well, economists are excellent in sticking to their times, especially because in 10 minutes we will hear from Professor Veronesi, who will draw the conclusions. So the very last 10 minutes of your attention, please. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I would also like to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak at this excellent conference. I shall try to give you a picture that is based around 5 principles or key ideas. First, why the economy of peace must be a sort of prescriptive or normative science, in the sense that it can dictate or determine the policies determined by policymakers. And this is what I am attempting to do with my presentation, trying to illustrate that. First, the first principle of the economy of peace is democracy. And you might wonder, what does democracy have to do with the economics? Well, that was the line of thinking of many economists in the past. But Alex actually showed us very clearly earlier that good and bad decisions depend on the way in which decisions are precisely made. I teach economic politics, and I devote a good part of my course to illustrate how decisions are made. In the past, economists used to separate economics from forms of government. At last, recently, we are going back home, so to speak, and increasing emphasis is placed on the actual decision-making process. And after 15 years, or better, 15 years later, we can now state with certainty that development, and especially sustainable long-term development, is possible only under democratic regimes. This might sound trivial, but that wasn't the case 30 years ago. It's not that straightforward. Why? Well, because economists were under the influence of benevolent dictators, which might sound like an oxymoron, but theoretically, benevolent or good dictators looked fascinating to economists because they were able to gather information from the market and make the best possible decision. Of course, such a thing doesn't exist in reality, but some people theoretically said that dictatorship sometimes could turn out to be better options for economy, and there is still a debate on this. I am referring to what we've heard this morning. I've heard reliable, authoritative colleagues wondering whether Pinochet was a good statesman given the chilly economic results. The fact that it was flouting human rights wasn't a factor that economists took into consideration. Thank God things changed. And we are now starting to go back to where we started off from, namely we are trying to figure out how societies are actually governed. So, the very first principle of the economics of peace is that democracy is one of the key tenets to construct peace and an economy of peace. Second slide now, which is a second principle. This is also a homecoming because it means going back to the definition of productive activities. The physiocrats in the past used to focus on defining what produced added value, what produced health, and what didn't. Modern economists go back to this distinction. So the economics of peace starts from the assumption that there are some activities that are economic because they use scant resources, and some of these generate new wealth, added value, but others don't. Earlier we mentioned military expenditure. Clearly, military expenditure are an example of non-productive use of resources. Of course, if we talk about military expenditure, it is clear that these are not beneficial activities or activities that can have a positive impact. But when it comes to market activities, sort of ordinary activities, well, in that area too, we must recognize that there are some activities that are more productive than others, or some activities that generate or cause more conflicts than others. I'll give you a very practical example. We know from literature that most civil wars waged in the world have economic reasons. In general, people tend to think that there are lots of wars that are waged because of oil. Let's assume that one of these wars were to end. How can we create wealth in this country that was in conflict? We invest heavily in the oil industry, or do we create an alternative? If we go for the first option, so we invest heavily in the oil industry, namely the one that triggered the civil war in the first place, then our GDP tomorrow will certainly be higher. But the probability of having another conflict if we do not develop other industries will increase. Think of Nigeria. Nigeria has been gripping with atrocious violence. Recently, there's news of a new Boko Haram action. And now the Islam extremism has somehow connected to the violence and the violent situation that was already there. If you take a look at Nigeria's GDP, it has grown in an extraordinary way, I mean, compared to the rest of the continent. But that wealth did not generate more peace. So, even there are some activities or some businesses that are, in a way, more peaceful than others. And I think that making these distinctions is part of the job of an economist of peace. And I'll give you another concrete example that I've been using for a couple of years now. We know that there is a very serious danger with Russia. In addition to the Ukraine conflict, we have recently seen some sort of muscle shows, muscular declarations from NATO and Russia. In the past decade, Russia basically impoverished its economy because following the 1998 recession, the Russian elite decided to invest everything on hydrocarbons. Hence, the rest of the economy was impoverished. Russia, in industrial terms, is doing less well than the former US used to do. So it went backwards in a way. 70% of Russian exports is accounted for by hydrocarbons. In the past, 1/3 of Russian exports were industrial goods. So these modifications in the structure of the economy, this overemphasis on a sector that generates, yes, income, but also conflicts, and gives you the idea of easy wealth, or a wealth that is easy to build up, well, has made Russia fragile, and it's almost pushed to war in a way. The Russian export of manufactured goods is less than 3%, so it's a dwarf in trade terms. These are things that peace economists were able to tell like 3 years ago, because they looked at numbers and they could guess that, because they don't just look at the GDP, but the different components of the GDP. And let me come to the third idea that lies at the basis of the economics of peace. A word has been used to define policy making, namely short-termism. It's a horrible concept. Basically, we have forgotten the value of time. The short-term outcome, the short-term benefits driven by financial markets meant that the focus was on precisely a short-term. We only focus on the growth of GDP as an indicator for the success of our policies. Well, that is precisely a form of short-termism, because the growth of GDP in a year or in a semester is something that is, of course, very meaningful for the economic situation, but it is very much linked to the short term. While one of the key principles of the economics of peace is to focus on time and to rediscover time. Giovannini talked about the future generation and how we need to look at it. And we have forgotten a bit about time. In public discourse, you hardly ever hear about long-term productivity. We economists, though, have been familiar with this since the 19th century, but we've forgotten about it. So rediscovering these parameters is also a homecoming of peace economy. So the idea is to take into account variables that reflect long-term results, because development is such and sustainable only over the long run. The fourth component is the following. Now, which is the key factor for long-term development? Well, human capital. After a very long period, it was high time we attributed the right dignity to human capital. And let me add something here. Many parties, of course, note that investing in education and healthcare is key, because they have such investments have very high returns on human capital. And peace economists, in case of having to cut portions of budget, well, they have no doubt they would cut 100 euros from guns, but not from school and education. So this amounts to saying that, of course, there are different facets depending on the countries we are looking at. There is something that we ignore or we neglect. I mean, human capital has some physical laws in a way, because if people are trained to do something, they can hardly change, or they can do that with some effort only. So think of countries that experienced a conflict, be it civil or international. Well, these people can hardly get back to a normal production setting in a way, or it is very hard for them to do so, especially those who have experienced war since when they were children. Sometimes we need to talk about a reconversion of, a retraining of the human capital, sending them, educating them in schools. That's not enough. We talk about education all the time, but we are not too sure about which level of education we need to focus on. Only recently have we understood that investing in early childhood produces more return in economic terms than investing in secondary or high school, albeit this is very important. In Italy, for instance, we do not have kindergarten. We do not have sufficient investment for early childhood. After years of studies, we've learned that it is more important to invest in early childhood. So peace economists do say, yes, let's invest in human capital, because human capital is the key factor. However, we need to understand what are the critical components of human capital, just as happens in a post-conflict society, because the needs in a post-conflict society differ from those in our society. And let me come to the very last basic principle of the peace economy. Here you might see the echoes of an ancient message that comes from a very distant past. That is to say, the opening up of countries. Very recently, it's become fashionable to talk about global inequality. Nobody likes it, of course, but oftentimes globalization, so the integration of economies, is seen as the culprit mechanism that generates inequality. And this doesn't make much sense for peace economists, because peace economists know for a fact that when countries closed in isolation, well, then that led to wars. Between World War I and II, economists started to look inward because of the Great Depression, and that led to World War II. And Lenz, who is quoted at all times, in one passage of his book, says, we must impose a free trade area between France and Germany. He said that in 1919. We would only do that in 1957. After the terrible mistakes committed in World War II. So what is the message here? Let's avoid isolation. Let me share with you a figure. Just in the aftermath of the economic recession in 2008, in 2009, 180 protectionist measures were announced by countries. Italy, 30, India, 48, many, 70 by the US. Well, you see, the idea is that the public opinion demands that. It sounds like a legitimate request, but peace economists know that that is not the case. It is key to regulate the opening of markets, yes, but markets must not be closed, and this must be supported even overcoming some taboos. For instance, we economists think that price should be left free to fluctuate on the market. Let's take farming, for instance. Farming is heavily controlled by EU, by the US and by China, but we want other countries to let it free. I'm focusing on the farming sector because in the past 7 years, when financial markets didn't know where to speculate, well, they turned to the commodity markets, so the farming markets. And what did that entail? Well, it entailed an average increase of price for food products between 5 and 7%. So it was really a heavy impact. Just think that in countries where households spend most of their income for food, well, that can have a devastating impact. So what is the position of peace economists here? Well, fine, our position is let's integrate our economy, but let's forget that prices cannot be regulated. We must. Yesterday we talked about food security. We must stop this creeping increase of food commodities. But there is a dark side to this, because you need to see things on a case-by-case basis. Let's take Afghanistan, for instance. Afghanistan has an opium-based economy. I was saying earlier, peace economists separate sectors that are beneficial from those that are detrimental to peace. In Afghanistan, we would need farmers to stop growing opium and start growing wheat. Higher wheat prices would be beneficial to Afghan people. While in 2012, what happens? There's a boom crop in Kazakhstan, so the prices go down, and farmers went back to growing opium because that was more profitable than growing wheat. This is just to say that if our goal is peace, we must discuss frankly about prices and without taboos, without biased attitudes. And then governing globalization, international organizations play a key role. WTO at the moment has an unexplored potential to do that. It's the first time ever in history when a democratic organization that can actually resolve conflicts. It is stalled at the moment, since it is very democratic. It is underestimated, but it is a great tool because countries used to fight wars because of trade. So let's not underestimate it. And international organizations should actually reiterate what was said some years ago, and then it has forgotten. the conditions set by the IMF should be modified or changed. And let me give you an example linked to prices. In 1997, big Asian crisis, Indonesia ends up without any money. They ask a loan from a bailout from the IMF. IMF, under Caruso, said, fine, but you need to liberalize rice prices because Indonesia had a regulated rice market. Suharto had to say yes. Between 96 and 99, inflation for food prices skyrocketed to 125%. If you look at the estimate of deaths that also led to the fall of Suharto's regime, well, there was an explosion of violence that coincided with skyrocketing food prices, determined by the fact that the IMF forced Indonesia to remove any regulation on rice prices. Let me come to my conclusion now. I tried to outline 5 key ideas that are nothing new, really, but they are simply contained in books that were written some 100 years ago. And we forgot about these in the past 20 years. So the economy of peace is somehow a homecoming. And I'd like to say that this is all about our interest in understanding how economies can thrive, not in the short term, but in the long run. Thank you.
Thank you for all the input. And so I would like to ask Professor Veronelli and Martinelli to draw the final conclusions of the present year Science for Peace.
Bene, ma Umberto ha chiesto di chiudere anche a nome suo, sarò molto breve.
Well, Umberto said I can draw conclusions also on his behalf. I will be very brief indeed. As usual, this was a conference that was rich in stimuli and had a very interesting, lively debate. I would like to concentrate on 2 elements that have been expressed here. The theme of the new global agenda for sustainable development, which has been the leitmotif of the entire day yesterday, and has been also mentioned by Giovannini. And I believe that we've been working really hard in this respect, because being capable of making sustainable development come true, equitable, fair amongst countries and in the countries from an environmental and ecological standpoint, will go in favor of peace. Peace is a fundamental objective, and we should be capable of pursuing all the objectives, all of these objectives concurrently. And we should abolish also life imprisonment. So going to prison should be the last possible option when, if anything else fails. Well, this is going to be reconsidered by all of you. I recommend that you continue to retrieve information from all sides. The Fondazione Veronesi is not there only during this conference, but we have a lot of activities. You can take a look at our website, and see you next year. Thank you all for participating.